Hello and welcome to Inside Update, brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. This show is all about giving you an update on some of the most important headlines across Connecticut, specifically those coming out of our nonprofit investigative newsroom. And today we have two doozies for you. I think really interesting stories. One, we're going to dig into Brandon's first investigation, first long form piece published with us, which is exciting in its own right. But he also did some really cool work looking at the history, past, and present, and I guess the future too, potentially, of Connecticut's 4-day work week experiments. And then we're going to jump over to Catherine and talk about some constitutional questions being raised in Enfield that I think are more broadly applicable. At least there are some lessons that should be learned across Connecticut, and some interesting legal takes here. Maybe some threatening letters. Maybe threatening is too strong. We'll get into that as well. Uh, let's start with Brandon, though. Listen, I want the background on the story, but just generally, I know this is your first foray into long form writing. It seems like it went really well. Kind of give us a little bit of both sides of that. How did this process go for you as well?
I'd like you said, I'd say it went pretty well. I guess one thing generally that I've learned about 4-day work weeks is whenever an employer implements it, they're very much excited to talk about it. So kind of made the story easy from that perspective. But yeah, it was interesting really just to dig into it. Like you said, when I started out with the story, I didn't know there would be so much 4-day work week lore involved here. I had no idea that this was something that had been previously implemented to the extent that it apparently was. But speaking with Professor Bird, who is kind of a work life balance, he told me that that was one of the issues that really fascinates him. He's a business professor. Um, yeah, he certainly was able to kind of help paint the picture and put into context why we're seeing this, as well as kind of the history of it. And it was funny because there's somewhat of a dichotomy, right? When I was reading through his sort of compilation of studies, and he was giving his own opinions on it, it seemed like he would be kind of very anti 4-day work week. But worthwhile to note was this report that he did. It came out in 2010, and so when I spoke to him over the phone, he was just like, it was almost like he himself was kind of head over the heels for the concept, whereas his writing almost seemed skeptical to me in a lot of points. And he was just he's like, oh well, a lot's changed, and I'm like, yeah, I suppose it kind of has. It's funny to think that 2010 was that long ago, but 14 years have passed, COVID happened, and employers are realizing we kind of got to give the people what they want a little bit, otherwise they won't take our jobs. And for 4-day work weeks, it seems to be a good kind of tool in the arsenal for employers. And what I also found was an interesting dichotomy from speaking with Professor Bird, and then also speaking with all these municipal people, the town administrators, mayors, you name it. Um, Professor Bird, he seemed very, when I asked him, where could we see this going in the future? What type of businesses or industries? How applicable is this to other industries? And which ones do you think would adopt it? He seems to think, he's like industries where it's kind of you don't have to be there, where they can offer remote work. Any sort of office job, essentially. He was thinking that that's probably where you'd see the most of it. But then when you speak to all the municipalities, it's kind of obvious, the reasons why they can't just have everyone go remote, because somebody's got to hold down the fort at town hall when grandma comes in to pay her taxes. Um, and it's kind of a very worthwhile tool for them because they can't offer, remote work. So they have to get a little creative, with their perks to make their jobs attractive. And so 4-day work weeks seem to really be the hot commodity among the public administration community because they can't offer remote work. So I thought that that was kind of interesting as well. So yeah, there's a lot here. There's a lot here, basically.
It's interesting that his opinion seems to have changed over time. Don't get me wrong, I love an academic skeptic. That's like where I want my academics to be, is not just trying to push a point of view. I like my journalists the same way. And that's such a nice thing to hear, though, is that, this evolves, this changes. I mean, you want to have ideas that are right for the time. Um, could you go way back for a second? I mean, you talked about the 60s and 70s, which was all news to me. I think you had written in there that at one point early in this period, there were something like 60 companies a month in America that were changing over to a 4-day work week. What's the deep history here?
Right. Okay. So apparently, to Bird studies, maybe there was a company doing this in 1910 we don't know about, but he saw the first two companies that he saw really kind of take on the 4-day work week were Mobile and Gulf, and they adopted it all the way back in 1940, but it was only for their truckers. So 4-day, 40-hour schedules, 10-hour days. But during the 1960s, it started to take off a little bit, and 1969 it's when it really started to take off. And yeah, like you had said, in the early 70s, apparently hundreds of companies began implementing this per year, 60 to 70 per month. And Bird thinks that it has something to do with the OPEC oil embargo, which obviously that would make a lot of sense. And that was another kind of interesting thing, was seeing the reasoning behind all of these various waves of implementation. So during the 70s, when there was the oil embargo, obviously it became a lot more expensive for employees and bosses to drive to work, and it became a lot more expensive for the people who owned these properties that you would work on to pay their gas and electric bills. So it kind of was seen as, okay, well, maybe we'll save money and we could also sell it off as, oh, look at us, we're such great employers, while we're at it. And he was, from the studies in that period, apparently employers were making very, very crazy claims. 400% increases in sales, random arbitrary increases in productivity, and it became kind of a bit of a craze. And so I could understand why he was a little skeptical with some of the figures that these people were citing back then. And as the oil embargo died down, the 4-day work week very quickly died down afterwards. And the second kind of wave where we saw this get implemented more recently also coincided with high oil prices, and that was as a result of the Great Recession, I suppose we call it now, of 2007. And so that's where kind of Connecticut got its first early adopters, and it was Danbury and there was a couple of other towns that may have adopted it then, but Danbury was the big one because it was, the biggest municipality of them all. And again, it started out as sort of a cost savings measure. And the funny thing, at least for me in finding this, is the cost savings measure thing is still kind of sold as a benefit. But then when you ask people, like, so how much money have you saved? Everyone's kind of like, I don't really know. So it seems to be not the most scientific process there. I would say that's definitely of all the benefits, critics would say that all of them are overrated, but from what I've seen, that seems to be the one that's really just, we throw it in there, but who's to say how much money we're actually saving? Um, but it became so popular with their municipal union in Danbury that even though when it was introduced, it was very controversial and people were like, how are we going to pick our kids up from school? How are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? I don't want to work longer days. They loved it and they still have it. And it doesn't seem like it's going anywhere anytime soon. And just from speaking to all of the municipal officials at these towns that are doing it now, it also seems to be that way. Obviously, they're a lot younger in the process, but I haven't heard really any negativity. That's just something that you admittedly need to put a lot of thought and coordination into. And, it certainly seems to run more smoothly when you take your employees' input into account and you kind of come at it with an open mind and are willing to tweak things. So, yeah, there was a much deeper history to this than I had ever anticipated, but it is interesting to see kind of how it contrasted from all the way back when to how it is now.
Absolutely. And again, credit to you. I know, we kind of threw you in here. Hey, Brandon, welcome aboard. Long form. Let's go. Jump in. This is the job, right? So congrats on getting your first long form piece out there. Spoiler alert, we have a lot more coming from Brandon. So on the website, I know you've been reading his news coverage, but his long form stuff continues to come together. And I'm actually really excited for the next one as well.
I'm really excited too.
It's gonna
Yeah.
be it's a wild story. Cold cases. Spoiler alert. I'll just tease it a little bit. Um, let's switch over to a local issue with perhaps statewide. There's a lot of bigger stuff when we're talking about constitutional questions. And Catherine, of course, you are the right person to dig into this, given your interest, your background, your understanding of these issues. What's going on in Enfield?
Well, so Enfield's Enfield's town green or the gazebo, which is located on the green, you have to get a permit, which is, not unusual in a lot of, kind of public squares in the town. Towns can reasonably allow for those kinds of activities to be permitted. But the problem with Enfield's policy is it is very broad and very, very vague. Um, and so some of the issues around this include that basically the town requires you to get a permit for pretty much any kind of event, not just like, hey, I want to hold a rally for, the local town candidate, but, hey, I want to hand out a leaflet for, whatever organization, the local dog pound or something like that. And the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, which is a great organization that advocates for the First Amendment, recently sent a letter to Enfield and to their town council, letting them know, hey, your policy for issuing permits is unconstitutional. And they listed a bunch of problems with that. Again, one of them is that, you know, because it's not clear, exactly what uses are covered by the policy, that lack of specificity and that vagueness is unconstitutional in itself. Um, that's also a prior restraint on speech, which again is unconstitutional. Um, and the policy also requires that if you want to have an event at the town, you have to submit this application in order to get the permit 10 days before your event, unless you want to have a religious event, in which case you have to submit it 60 days before your event, which, at that point, when you're specifically singling out speech based on its content, that's a pretty bright line First Amendment violation, so that's another issue. They also require that if you want to have an event, again, and this could be something as simple as, hey, I want to hand out pamphlets for the local, dog pound, you have to have $1 million worth of insurance and provide proof of that, which again probably puts, a lot of First Amendment activity beyond normal people who probably don't carry $1 million worth of insurance just so they can go hand out pamphlets on the town green. Another issue is that they also require that any police that the town decides that needs to be there for an event has to be paid for by the event organizer, which again, according to Fire, is a problem because it creates, this situation where if the town decides, hey, I've decided I want to invite this controversial speaker, to do something, and the town decides, well, that could create a lot of problems, so we're going to require that you pay for extra police, then again, you're treating different speech differently and creating, heckler's veto and all sorts of things. One of the things that they pointed out when we spoke to them about this article is that, that's one of the way that civil rights protests were shut down in the 60s is, if you're bringing someone like Martin Luther King and people are going to counter protest, then we can say, well, this is going to be too much damage to the town. There's too much risk here. So you can't do this. The town has not responded either to fire about how they intend to change this. They also didn't respond to our requests for comment. When I initially reached out to the town, they first, excuse me, actually asked me what I was referring to because they weren't sure if they had received the letter. So I sent it back to them because it's posted online. And we never got any response again after that. So we'll see what happens. Fire has plans to continue to follow up on this and hopefully work with the town to get these policies changed so that people's First Amendment rights are protected.
I'll take the optimistic view. Maybe their public relations person needed to file for $1 million insurance policy before they spoke publicly on the issue. Um, they really, fire is not pulling punches. I know they've been in the news generally recently because they're active in a lot of the campus discussion that's going on, but I was surprised to see attorneys using that type of language, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I mean, that's some really strong language from a legal professional. Um, I guess their name's Fire, so it makes sense. They're just kind of laying it all out there. Do they anticipate a response? I mean, what's the next step for them in getting this resolved, or is it going to have to go to a lawsuit?
Um, excuse me. So they said if they don't hear back to them, I think they gave them a two week deadline from when they submitted the letter. They'll regroup and decide how to go from there. They said one of their first steps is usually just to follow up and to reiterate their concerns. I would imagine that, if they don't respond, then they'll, continue to find other ways to press them to make sure that this policy gets changed.
Absolutely. That's great. It's a really, really good article. Both of you, thank you for what you've done over these past couple weeks and following up. Uh, Anything else that you guys have on your minds? Any topics you're looking for tips on? Anything that folks need to know about? All right. Then I will just say here, this is the tip of the iceberg. Moving from talking about 3 articles to 2 articles in this show to kind of keep it in a manageable amount of time. We have articles coming out every single day and a lot of updates on important stuff. Lamont, for example, quietly filled the vacancies on the contracting board that Mark wrote about a few weeks ago. There's a whole bunch of stuff about job growth and some tax exemptions coming out. Some really important things to stay informed about what's going on in Connecticut. You can find all of that at insideinvestigator.org. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting our nonprofit newsroom. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.